August 19, 1944. Wehrmacht High Command Headquarters, East Prussia. The war map stretched across the long wooden table like a wounded animal. Red and blue pins marked the front lines, arrows showing advances, retreats, and counterattacks. Most of the arrows in the west pointed eastward. Too fast, some believed. General Oberst Alfred Jodl stood silently, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the latest intelligence summaries from France, reports from Normandy, from Brittany, from the Seine Basin. The Americans were moving faster than any army had a right to move. Too fast. Jodl had seen this before. Every German general in the room had. Rapid advances always ended the same way, not in victory, but in exhaustion. Supply lines stretched. Fuel ran dry. Engines failed. Momentum collapsed. War was not won by speed alone. War was won by logistics. The staff officers had already done the calculations. They trusted mathematics more than optimism. Patton's Third Army had surged hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches. Tank columns raced across liberated French towns. Infantry followed in clouds of dust. But behind them lay a growing problem. Distance. More than 400 miles. Now separated the advancing American spearheads from their original supply depots. Jodl allowed himself a thin smile. No army in history had sustained such a pace for long. An armored division, when advancing, consumed staggering quantities of fuel, up to 150,000 gallons per day. Ammunition followed the same logic. Food, spare, parts, tires, oil, medical supplies. Steel and men could move only as fast as fuel allowed. From Hitler's Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the conclusion seemed inevitable. The Americans had outrun their logistics. Patton would have to stop. Not next month, not next week, within days, perhaps hours. When the advance stalled, Germany would regroup along the Seine. Defensive lines would stabilize. Winter would arrive, and time, Germany's last remaining ally, would once again take the field. This was not hope, it was experience. The German General Staff did not underestimate logistics. On the contrary, they understood it too well. They had invented blitzkrieg, combining armor, infantry, and air power into a single devastating weapon. They had rewritten the rules of maneuver warfare, but they had also learned its limits the hard way. Nowhere was that lesson clearer than in the East. In Russia, the Wehrmacht's advance had not initially failed because of Soviet resistance. It failed because supply lines collapsed under their own weight. German trucks broke down on primitive roads. Fuel froze in winter. Railways used incompatible gauges. And despite mechanization myths, nearly 80% of German transport remained horse-drawn. Panzers surged forward faster than wagons could follow. Ammunition piled up hundreds of miles from the front. Armies halted not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. The same fate, German planners believed, awaited the Americans. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, soon to command the 47th Panzer Corps, wrote confidently in July 1944, "The Americans face the same impossibility we faced in Russia. Their mechanical strength becomes a weakness. Machines require fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. They have advanced 400 miles in 30 days. History tells us what comes next: paralysis." German intelligence tracked American consumption obsessively. A single Sherman tank burned fuel at an alarming rate, barely half a mile per gallon on roads, worse across fields. An infantry division required 700 tons of supplies per day. An armored division required 1,000 tons. Patton commanded 12 divisions advancing on a broad front. The numbers were brutal. More than 12,000 tons of supplies every day, hauled across shattered French roads. Bridges destroyed by retreating German engineers, rail lines bombed into uselessness, even if the Americans had unlimited trucks, which they didn't. Even if the roads were perfect, which they weren't. Even if engines never failed, which was impossible. It still wouldn't work. On August 20th, German planners finalized their verdict. Physical laws could not be broken, not even by American industry. Patton's Third Army, they concluded, had at most 48 hours left before it ground to a halt. What they did not know, what no German intelligence report yet mentioned, was that the laws of warfare were about to change, because far to the west, beyond their calculations, beyond their doctrine, beyond their imagination, thousands of American trucks were already moving. In war, there are moments when doctrine collapses under reality. By late August 1944, the American advance across France was no longer just rapid. It was unprecedented. Entire German armies were retreating in disarray. Cities fell in days, sometimes hours. The momentum was intoxicating. But behind the front lines, in dusty command tents and makeshift headquarters, a crisis was unfolding. The American armies were starving, not of men, not of courage, but of fuel. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, stared at the same numbers the Germans had calculated. The supply depots remained anchored near the Normandy beaches. The rail network lay in ruins. French ports were either destroyed or still in German hands. The arithmetic was merciless. If nothing changed, Patton's tanks would stop within days. Bradley did something extraordinary. He authorized an operation that violated nearly every rule of military logistics. There would be no railroads, no forward depots, no layered supply system. Instead, supplies would move directly from the beaches to the front, nonstop, day and night, by truck alone. It was a gamble bordering on insanity. The operation was given a name taken from the railroad, World, a term signifying absolute priority. The Red Ball Express, a one-way army. On August 25, 1944, orders went out across the communications zone. 2 French highways would be seized for exclusive military use. One eastbound, one westbound. Civilian traffic was banned. Military vehicles not assigned to the operation were forbidden entry. Military police lined the roads, enforcing the rules with ruthless efficiency. Red circles were painted on signs, vehicles, and maps, simple symbols marking the arteries of an army. The rules were brutally simple. Trucks would move east loaded. Trucks would return west empty. Stops were forbidden except for breakdowns. Speed limits were suggestions, not laws. Each convoy carried fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, whatever the front demanded that hour. If a truck broke down, it was pushed off the road. If a driver collapsed, another took the wheel. If headlights failed, trucks drove on anyway. The system was crude. It was dangerous. It was wildly inefficient by textbook standards. But it worked. The men who made it move. The decision solved nothing without drivers, and the United States Army had a solution ready. One born not of military planning, but of American segregation. More than 3/4 of Red Ball Express drivers were African-American soldiers. Many had been denied combat roles. Many had been told they were unfit for frontline service. Now, they were handed the most critical mission of the campaign. They drove for 18 to 20 hours a day. They slept beside their trucks. They navigated bombed roads, blackout conditions, and German air attacks. Some units called it the Never Stop Express. Accidents were frequent. Fatigue was constant. Death was an accepted risk. Yet the trucks kept moving. History often remembers generals, maps, arrows, victories. But wars are moved by people whose names never appear in textbooks. On the roads of France in 1944, the Red Ball Express was not powered by strategy alone. It was powered by human endurance pushed beyond reason. The drivers were young, many barely out of their teens. Most had never left the United States before the war. Few had received proper mechanical training. Fewer still had been prepared for what awaited them. On the shattered highways of liberated France, they were given a truck, a route, and a single instruction: do not stop. Segregation and necessity. The United States Army of 1944 was segregated. African-American soldiers were overwhelmingly assigned to service. Units, quartermasters, engineers, truck companies. Before Normandy, many of these men had been told their role was secondary: support, labor, logistics. Yet when the crisis came, it was these units that stood between victory and paralysis. The irony was stark. Men denied equality at home were entrusted with the survival of the largest mechanized army in history. Their officers understood the pressure. If the truck stopped, Patton stopped. If Patton stopped, the war in the West might freeze for months. Failure was not an option. The road itself as an enemy. The French road network was never designed for modern warfare. Narrow lanes twisted through villages built centuries earlier. Stone bridges cracked under the weight of overloaded trucks. Bomb craters forced sudden detours into fields and forests. Rain turned dirt roads into rivers of mud. Dust choked engines in dry weather. Tires wore down to bare fabric in days. Breakdowns were inevitable. When a truck failed, the driver did not wait for assistance. He pushed it aside. Salvage crews would deal with it later, if there was time. Convoys drove with blackout lights at night. Thin slits of illumination, barely enough to see the rear bumper ahead. Collisions were common. Fires were deadly. And always, there was the threat from above. Though the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, German fighters and bombers still prowled for targets of opportunity. A single strafing run could turn a convoy into an inferno. Drivers learned to scatter at the sound of engines. They learned to dive into ditches. They learned to keep moving. Fatigue without limits. Official regulations limited driving hours. Reality ignored them. Drivers slept in snatches, 10 minutes here, half an hour there, curled beneath their trucks or slumped over steering wheels. Coffee and cigarettes became currency. Exhaustion blurred vision and judgment. Some men drove until their hands bled from the wheel. Some hallucinated from lack of sleep. Some simply collapsed and were replaced. There were no parades on the Red Ball Express. No glory, only motion. The unseen front line. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express had moved over 400,000 tons of supplies. More than 6,000 trucks were on the road at any given time. By early September 1944, something had gone terribly wrong in the German calculations. The pause never came. Day after day, German field reports repeated the same impossible observation. American armored columns continued to advance at full strength. Fuel shortages, expected, predicted, and planned for, did not materialize. To the German command, this was not merely unexpected. It was unnerving. Intelligence failure. German reconnaissance units watched. American supply roads through binoculars and aerial photography. They saw endless columns of trucks, dust clouds stretching to the horizon, engines growling without pause. At first, German analysts dismissed the reports as exaggerations. No truck-based system could sustain such volume. No army could depend on rubber tires and gasoline across hundreds of miles of ruined infrastructure. But the evidence accumulated. Captured American documents mentioned something called the Red Ball Express. Interrogated prisoners spoke of nonstop driving, of highways reserved for supply traffic alone. The German general staff struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they believed about modern war. Their doctrine said it was impossible. Reality disagreed. The strategic consequences. The continued American momentum shattered German defensive planning. The Wehrmacht had hoped to establish a coherent defensive line along the Seine. That line never stabilized. Units arrived late, understrength, short of fuel and ammunition of their own. German formations were forced into constant retreat, often abandoning heavy equipment not because of enemy pressure, but because their own supply systems could not keep pace. Ironically, the very problem Germany had expected the Americans to face now afflicted German units instead. Fuel shortages became endemic. Ammunition ran low. Repair depots fell behind the front and were overrun. American logistics, once assumed to be the weak link, had become an offensive weapon. Psychological collapse. Beyond the physical consequences lay something more dangerous. Doubt. German officers began questioning assumptions that had guided them since the early days of Blitzkrieg. Speed had once been Germany's advantage. Now it belonged entirely to the enemy. Field commanders sent increasingly desperate messages to higher headquarters. How are they supplying this? When will they stop? Is this sustainable? No one had answers. What Germany faced was not just an army. It was an industrial system operating at full capacity. improvising faster than German planners could adapt. A new kind of war. The Red Ball Express exposed a truth that the German command had been slow to accept. This was no longer a war of maneuver alone. It was a war of production, organization, and endurance. American factories replaced broken trucks faster than German pilots could destroy them. Spare parts arrived almost as quickly as frontline units requested them. Fuel flowed like water. By mid-September 1944, German commanders no longer spoke about stopping Patton's Third Army. They spoke about surviving it. The Red Ball Express had revealed something the Wehrmacht had never truly faced before. A nation capable of turning raw industrial power directly into battlefield momentum without pause, without restraint. The American production mindset. German military culture prized efficiency, conservation, and technical perfection. Every vehicle was maintained, repaired, and preserved. Every shell was counted. American doctrine operated on a different logic. Machines were consumable. Trucks were driven until they failed, then replaced. Engines were swapped instead of rebuilt. Worn tires were discarded rather than patched. Entire vehicles were abandoned if repair would take more than minutes. To German engineers, this was insanity. To American planners, it was math. The United States had calculated expected losses in advance and produced far beyond them. Factories as weapons. By 1944, American factories were producing over 50,000 trucks per month, thousands of spare engines weekly, fuel in quantities that dwarfed European reserves. The GMC CCK CW2 Deuce and a Half was the embodiment of this philosophy. It was not elegant. It was not refined. It was reliable, simple, and replaceable. German trucks, many hand-assembled, varied in parts and maintenance requirements. American trucks were standardized to the bolt. Any mechanic could work on any vehicle. This standardization allowed mass maintenance at unprecedented speed. Redundancy over perfection. German logistics relied on precision scheduling. When rail lines were cut or bridges destroyed, the system collapsed. American logistics assumed disruption. Multiple routes existed for every destination. Convoys were rerouted on the fly. When roads failed, engineers bulldozed new ones overnight. When bridges fell, temporary spans appeared in hours. Failure was not an exception. It was planned for. Why Germany couldn't compete. The Wehrmacht's transport system remained dependent on railways vulnerable to air attack, horse-drawn wagons for over half its logistics, fuel reserves that never recovered from Allied bombing. German industry could not replace losses at the rate required. Each destroyed vehicle was a strategic setback. American industry treated losses as background noise. This difference in mindset made defeat inevitable. Logistics as an offensive weapon. The Red Ball Express did not simply support combat operations. It created them. American commanders no longer planned around supply limitations. They planned around enemy reaction time. If fuel and ammunition could arrive anywhere within hours, the front became fluid, and German defenses meaningless. The faster Americans advanced, the harder it became for Germany to respond. The unthinkable realization. Captured German officers summarized the situation bluntly. They do not wage war the way we understand it. Behind every mile of American advance in late 1944 stood men. The German command barely acknowledged in its calculations. They were not tank aces. They were not generals. They did not appear in victory communiques. They were truck drivers. The invisible army. The Red Ball Express employed more than 23,000 drivers, and nearly three-quarters of them were African American, soldiers serving in a segregated U.S. Army. Most had never been trained for combat. Many had been assigned to service units under the assumption that they were unsuited for frontline duty. Yet these men became the single most important reason Patton's army never stopped moving. German intelligence categorized logistics troops as secondary targets. They were wrong. Life on the Red Ball. Red Ball drivers lived inside their trucks. Typical shifts lasted 18 to 20 hours, often extending to 72 hours without sleep. Drivers relied on benzodrine, coffee, and sheer adrenaline to stay awake. Roads were cratered, jammed, or destroyed. Traffic discipline was enforced not by courtesy, but by necessity. Any vehicle that slowed the flow was pushed aside, sometimes into ditches. Without hesitation, speed mattered more than comfort. Survival mattered more than rules. A culture of speed. The drivers developed their own unwritten code. Slow trucks pull off immediately. Breakdowns are removed in minutes. No stopping for anything but fuel or fire. Convoys keep moving, always. Trucks carried hand-painted slogans. Hitler's hearse, Detroit to Berlin, Patton's lifeline. Each truck was a declaration of defiance. Risk without recognition. Accidents were constant. Fog, rain, damaged bridges, and exhaustion killed hundreds. Trucks overturned, collided, burned from overheated engines. Many drivers died without ever seeing the front lines they were supplying. Yet morale remained high. These men knew their work mattered. They understood that every mile driven was a direct blow against Nazi ideology. They were disproving racial myths not with speeches, but with performance. German confusion. Captured German soldiers were stunned by what they saw. Nazi propaganda had portrayed African Americans as inferior, incapable of discipline or technical skill. Yet here they were, managing convoys, performing repairs, calculating loads, improvising routes under pressure. Some German prisoners were forced to load American trucks. Many later admitted it shattered everything they had been taught. The cost of endurance. By the end of the Red Ball Express operation, over 300 drivers had been killed. Thousands suffered injuries or long-term exhaustion. Most returned home to a country that still denied them basic civil rights. Their contribution went largely unrecognized for decades, but without them, the advance would have stopped. The quiet truth. The Red Ball Express proved something profound. Wars are not won only by those who fire the weapons. They are won by those who ensure the weapons never run out. By late September 1944, the German High Command understood a reality it had spent years denying. The war in the West was lost, not because of a single battle, not because of one brilliant maneuver, but because Germany could no longer compete with the scale of American power. The moment of clarity. Captured intelligence reports now agreed on one conclusion. American logistics had removed time as a limiting factor. German planners could no longer count on pauses. No regrouping window appeared. No exhaustion phase followed American breakthroughs. The Red Ball Express ensured that momentum, once gained, was never surrendered. Field Marshal Walter Model summarized it grimly. "We are not being defeated by tactics. We are being suffocated by abundance." Defensive lines that never formed. German defensive strategy depended on slowing the enemy long enough to dig in, stockpile ammunition, and restore coherence. That strategy collapsed completely. Every time German forces attempted to establish a defensive line, along the Seine, the Marne, the Moselle, it was already obsolete by the time orders reached the field. American units arrived fully supplied, ready to attack again within hours. There was no breathing space. The sound of defeat. German soldiers described a new kind of battlefield terror. At night they heard engines, not tanks, not aircraft, trucks, an endless mechanical rumble echoing through the darkness. Supplies moving forward while German units rationed their last fuel and ammunition. The sound became a reminder of inevitability. America was not running out. Germany already had. Logistics as destiny. The Red Ball Express forced German commanders to confront an unthinkable truth. They were fighting an enemy whose economy was larger than Europe's combined, whose factories operated beyond bombing range, and whose logistics doctrine embraced waste as strength. This was not something battlefield brilliance could overcome. It was structural. The strategic aftermath. By October 1944, German armored units were immobilized by fuel shortages. Artillery fire was rationed to preserve shells. Infantry divisions fought without replacements. Meanwhile, American forces prepared for the final push toward the Rhine, fully supplied, rested, and reinforced. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the timeline remained uncertain. The unacknowledged turning point. The Red Ball Express ended officially in November 1944, replaced by rail and port logistics as Allied infrastructure caught up. But by then, its work was done. It had carried more than 400,000 tons of supplies. It had kept Patton moving when German generals were certain he would stop. It had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. Final realization. A captured German staff officer summed it up during interrogation. We prepared to fight an army. We were unprepared to fight a system. The Red Ball Express was not just a supply operation. It was the moment industrial warfare reached maturity.